And the reason I insist on calling it a regime is because these people don't believe in small r Republican principles. They don't believe that there is a common good to which they owe a moral obligation, as many Republicans and Democrat leaders leading up to this point have. They hate what the everyday American stands for.
Today I sit down with President of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts. We discuss Heritage's comprehensive vision on dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, how Heritage has changed since Roberts' arrival, the 2025 presidential transition project, and Tucker Carlson's last speech as a Fox host at the Heritage Gala.
Project 2025, the aim of which is to take the biggest dagger ever and place it firmly in the center of the heart of the deep state.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Kevin Roberts, such a pleasure to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
It is always great to be with you, Jan.
Well, Kevin, first of all, congratulations on this, huge event that you just organized celebrating Heritage's 50th anniversary. Your keynote was Tucker Carlson. I think it must be his last appearance before he's left Fox suddenly, and this was something none of us were expecting. I don't know, did you get any hints of this?
No first-hand knowledge about that. I even made a joke about Tucker coming back to Heritage if his then current gig went south, and that was completely in jest. But what I do know about Tucker is he's one of the visionaries of our movement, and we look forward to him landing on his feet, which I'm sure he will.
Well, but what do you think happened?
I think Fox was too focused on being the big corporate media giant and has lost touch with the everyday American. And Heritage will always be on Fox if we're invited, talking about the everyday American. We consider them friends, but Tucker is an even closer friend, and he's bigger than Fox. And the future of America really goes through Tucker's mind, if you will.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, this is the #1 rated show on television for quite some time, and by quite a margin. Right? So it's kind of, you wonder what could possibly be the rationale in this sort of situation. But we are in unprecedented media times. And this is, I felt like this is something we could actually discuss because that's very relevant to what Heritage is doing.
Well, if I may,
yeah.
and I know you well enough personally and know Epoch Times well to know that you love the truth. We live in a time when the larger an organization gets, the larger a corporation gets, even if it's a friendly one like our friends at Fox, they become less enamored with telling the truth when it hurts. And what so many Americans and so many people around the world love about Tucker, they love about Epoch Times, is that you tell the truth. And dare I say, that's also what they love about the Heritage Foundation. So it's our job at Heritage, it's my job in particular at Heritage, to always sustain friendships with people who tell the truth even when it hurts, because we have a country to save.
Are you ever worried about the fact that Heritage is kind of big when it comes to think tanks? Is it maybe the largest one? I'm not sure, but I would guess it would be up there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes when people use the derogatory phrase conservative Inc., I think sometimes they're thinking about Heritage. Yeah, you know that I'm going to take the elephant in the room and put it on the table. And so I'm aware of that, but if you step inside Heritage, as you have done a few times, you know that because we're supported by hundreds of thousands of regular Americans each year, as opposed to 5 or 10 white knights inside the imperial city of DC, our DNA is to fight for the everyday American. So it's something we have to be aware of, but part of our culture internally at Heritage is to be aware of that and to check whatever impulse that may come from going to the cocktail parties that so many establishment people like to do. It's just not our jam, it's not mine, and that's one of the ways that we keep it real.
Well, since we're talking about this, something that's really dawned on me, just kind of watching what I would call systemic problems in many, many areas in our society. When things get very big, right, when the scale becomes very large, it seems to me there's this trend of they start to take on a life of their own. They start acting to self-perpetuate.
Self-perpetuation is the unhealthy symptom of a bureaucracy. And so any business, any organization is prone to that if it gets large enough. I see this most often in second or third generation family businesses, which were probably started with $100 or $1,000 that someone saved on the side and put all their chips into the table. And then by the second or third generation, because of the success of that entrepreneur, his or her children, grandchildren haven't really shared in that sacrifice. And so I think the key, having started a K through 12 school, being the second president of a small college, run 2 nonprofit policy groups, is to always have each generation of colleagues to participate in sacrifice, to know what it means, in our case at Heritage, to fight for the everyday American. When you start seeing an organization not take risks, that's a key sign. To me, it's a red flag that they've become part of the problem. They're more focused on self-perpetuation.
So I'll have to say that under your tenure, it seems to me like Heritage has started taking a lot more risks, and that it seems very deliberate on your part.
It's very intentional, every day.
What was the risk that you took that you think is the one that paid off best at this point?
A lot come to mind. My colleagues deserve all the credit for that because they're the ones in the trenches taking the risks. They're the ones getting belligerent emails from the establishment in DC about why are you taking these risks? But the one that's paid off so much is our China paper. For the better part of a year, we've been focused on making sure that the policy prescriptions coming out of Heritage relative to the Chinese Communist Party are vigorous, that they understand or they explain the stakes for free people around the world. And I will say, and no hubris when I say this, I'm so proud of my colleagues at Heritage because, Jan, this is almost literally true. Almost every policy person at Heritage, a couple hundred people, had a hand in that China paper. Our domestic policy folks, our economists, our education scholars, obviously our foreign policy colleagues, particularly those who know about East Asia, but the CCP has infiltrated nearly every country in the world, so this had to be a whole of Heritage approach to a whole of government problem, right? And it's already paying off because you see a shift in the rhetoric soon in Congress. Hopefully soon we'll see a shift in some of the legislative priorities that are coming out. And let's hope that on January 20th, 2025, we replace the very CCP-friendly president of the United States with a man or a woman who knows what time it is. And the time that it is to confront them, to defeat them, to eliminate them.
Of course, I was going to be talking about, this is the Winning the New Cold War paper. This is a very, very impressive piece of work. And the other piece that I learned recently as I interviewed one of your fellows, Michael Pillsbury, you were looking at actual past proposed bills in many cases that were offered. Like this is thinking that has been done. This isn't something that you've kind of all rehashed from scratch or something like that. But a great many of these bills that were proposed that were actually, I guess, very smart about what they were trying to accomplish just never made it. And in one case, I was told there was a bill that got past the House, past the Senate, and then disappeared when the NDAA was passed in the end. Now that was astounding to me.
It is, and that example is but one of several dozen. And so what we're trying to do with this paper is survey the legislation in the case of that particular bill, law, that has been passed, but also in addition to that, propose new legislation that can piggyback on those good ideas. But more than anything else is just to provide an honest, objective assessment of the policy landscape. That is the problem side of policy, but as well as the solution side of policy. And so what we're hoping to do with this paper is to have built a foundation on which subsequent analyses by Heritage, by a growing number of friends in the movement, will be able to assess what we must do to confront the CCP. We're probably more than cautiously optimistic that we've made some progress here. We're actually really confident that we've helped to change the debate.
Well, I'll mention one piece which I think is very risky in this town, and that's you advocating for stopping all CCP lobbying dollars in this town. And I think there's a lot of people that like those dollars.
It's outrageous to me, Jan, that there would be any American citizen, probably within blocks of where you and I are sitting having this conversation, who would take $1 from a CCP interest. In other words, it would seem to me that someone would love this country so much and understand the evil that the CCP represents and advocates around the planet and wouldn't do that. But if it takes legislation to correct that, then Heritage is very happy to lead the way. We're not going to stop working on that issue until there is a bill that bans lobbyists in this town from representing the Chinese Communist Party.
What do you think, and maybe we discussed it already, but what do you think would be, one or two of the most important recommendations in that paper? Because I know that you've looked at it closely.
There are several dozen recommendations. I would encourage people watching or listening to this to track it down. And I say that as the president of Heritage, not just because it's a Heritage paper, but as someone who loves this country and wants every person on the planet to flourish and knows that the CCP is standing in the way. This paper is the blueprint of how you fix it. But having said that, I think at the top of the list is recognizing that there shouldn't be CCP investment in the American military industry. We live at a time when we have supply chain issues, accentuated, I might say, by overspending on the heroic Ukrainians. But the other problem is that we have American investment in China. And so we have to be careful, those of us who like a market economy, at banning American investment elsewhere. But perhaps what we also need to be doing is reinstilling in the CEOs and corporate boards of American businesses a desire not to invest in CCP-owned interests in China and elsewhere, which leads me to the final point in terms of recommendations, because this goes beyond just the CCP. We need to be reshoring or friendshoring jobs that are in China. Americans should be benefiting by any additional military production that we're going to be engaged in order to defend Taiwan, which we will do. There are a lot of recommendations in that paper. The ones that I've mentioned are focused on the defense posture that the United States must have toward the CCP, but I'll also say we have to be really cognizant of the influence the CCP has in education. Obviously, with the formerly named Confucius Institutes that have been renamed to something else, we should not be allowing the CCP to have infiltrated our major research universities.
Just something just occurred to me, this bill that we were talking about that passed the House, passed the Senate, disappeared from the NDAA, that was a bill that dealt with basically not buying drones from China, right? Which is kind of, you would think, wow, that would
should
be
be
crazy.
common sense.
Right. But what I heard, though, and this is to your other point that you mentioned about nearshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, is that there just aren't a lot of options. This is what I heard from the industry. Like, let's say you want to buy drones. Where do you get them? Who do you get them? Well, it's a very serious situation in many areas, right?
No, that's true. There aren't a lot of options for drones. And yet, that's a function of our own choices. That is to say, it's one thing for Heritage and some friends to push good bills through Congress. It's one thing for a majority of members of the House and Senate to vote for that and for the president to sign it. That's one thing. But it's a much more important matter. It's a greater obligation for individual Americans, especially those who have capital to invest, to stop being worried so significantly about a few pennies of difference in investment. That is, it's more important to have an American-made drone or a drone made in a country that's a real ally of ours than it is to save a few dollars because you've made it in China. This is the kind of thing that must change in the United States. In other words, we're not going to defeat the CCP simply by passing legislation. We need Americans, and in particular American entrepreneurs, to worry about the United States first and American workers first and the future of American freedom first before they worry about, as they would tell you and me, their bottom line.
There's this idea, of course, voiced by many in the past that both of us are familiar with, that a strong America provides some higher level of security, and a weaker America, and I think nobody would argue that America isn't weaker now than it was even, let's say, definitely 10 years ago, that creates a lot of instability, not just here, but also, internationally.
Since the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 1980s, each passing 5 years or each passing decade, we've gotten weaker. And yes, you might say, well, we of course had the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, but I actually think those were a sign of weakness. They were the sign of a country, of a civil society that was decaying from within, that was losing its own moral authority, not just abroad, but also domestically. And so this is why at Heritage we believe this, when we're talking about the CCP and the threat that it poses, we aren't just talking about a military posture, but we're also talking about an economic and social posture. The United States is weaker, best as I can tell, in every way, but the weakest that it's become is not just its own politics, but our own society and culture, where you can't love what you don't know. And given how poorly we teach American history and civics, we have a full generation, if not more, of Americans who don't appreciate what it is about America that causes most people in the world to see us as the North Star.
I want to ask you something here, actually, because Heritage is obviously considered a conservative think tank, obviously, right? But
I hope so.
a lot of people have been discussing with me, and I like to ask this question of my guests, that this conventional left and right measures, a lot of people say, well, what does that even mean? Actually in the speech that Tucker Carlson gave, he talks about that I'm kind of agreeing with people that I just wouldn't have even imagined, being kind of on the same side with or something, say 5 years ago before COVID. So there's a few kind of alternative spectrums which have been proposed, right? One is a cognitive liberty spectrum, people that believe that you should be able to believe what you want to believe, versus people who believe you should believe something very specific and everyone should believe that way, right? So that's one. Another one is, and I've been thinking about this is the one that I'm kind of gravitating towards, is the people who have some sense of the transcendent versus people who are, let's say, purely transactional or mostly transactional. It's a very different mentality, right? It strikes me that what Heritage is doing, and I haven't seen the entirety because you guys do a lot.
It's hard to keep up with everything we do.
I'm amazed you even know.
Oh, you just assume that I do.
Is it really just for conservatives? Because it strikes me when I look at this China plan, this is not just for conservatives. This is just basic common sense.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
Of course, this China plan, we would hope, would be adopted, endorsed, advocated by every American. In fact, I grew up at a time in the United States when left of center folks, at that time, most left of center politicians would have endorsed this China plan that Heritage put out. So we operate that way. We talk to Democrat offices in the House and Senate, whose members I think will be real important advocates for this. To your larger point about conservatism, I will say, though, I'll just take the opportunity to mention, conservatism has always been about the transcendent. And so what Heritage is trying to do with the China paper, but even more broadly, is to say, we're just getting back to our roots as conservatives. We've always been focused on the permanent things, as we like to say, in the American and Anglo tradition. And while the free market is part of that, and the economy obviously is part of that, those are healthy symptoms of a very healthy society. And conservatives, whether they were Burke or Russell Kirk or T.S. Eliot, they're always focused, have always been focused on the permanent things. Heritage is trying to remind people that the reason you want to endorse the China paper, the reason you want to pass those bills, isn't just to defeat the CCP. It isn't just to say that conservatives in America got to win, but for every American and every human person on earth to live the good life. That's what conservatives care about the most.
Interesting. That's definitely not the common rhetoric.
No, especially in DC, because we have so many people who are former conservatives. I mean, they're no longer conservatives. They actually reject the transcendent. They reject the permanent things. Who do what? They're only focused on the free market, as if that's the totality of American conservative thinking.
Fascinating. I was speaking with Mark Tapscott, one of our congressional correspondents, about he actually worked at Heritage for 6 years under Ed Fulner. And this is what he told me. Where I was saying we're gonna do this interview. He said, well, after Ed Fulner left Heritage, there was this perceived lack of direction, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe people were wondering what was going to happen, and that perhaps, and it seems to me that today Heritage is a very, very clear direction in many areas, right? Especially, looking at this 2025, transition kind of behemoth of a transition plan that can barely lift, never mind read. But it seems to me like you're very clear on what you're doing at this point. And I guess maybe I'll ask you, I wonder how much, your joining Heritage, you think, has played a role in that?
Well, it's a fair question, and I'm not only grateful to, but friends with all of my predecessors. And so people know I am building on the foundations that they laid. If I've brought anything to Heritage, I think it is a clear direction. And I think that comes not from some wisdom that I uniquely possess, but something that tens of millions of Americans possess. And you pretty much have to be a human product of outside the Beltway in order to possess this, and it's called common sense. And so common sense tells someone that there's something broken about America. Common sense would then tell someone that a great venerable institution like Heritage, which has had many great leaders and many great scholars, has material resources, but even more important than the material resources, it has soft power. It has convening power. It has influence. And what I have said is, let's use all of those things for the sake of saving America, because I actually believe we have a very finite amount of time to change course in this country. I'm optimistic we're going to do it, but I also don't believe that we have the luxury of a few decades to do it. And that's why if people observing Heritage the last couple of years in my leadership have a sense that we're in a hurry, that we're urgent, it's because we are every single day. As the first thing I said to my colleagues when I was president, announced as president of Heritage, was we're going to be on offense every day, every hour for the American people. And I'm so proud of them because we haven't stopped yet.